A Chinese girl came desperate for work, until the mountain man said, "You'll find more than wages here." The light pink silk tunic, thin and useless against the biting wind of the Montana Territory, was the only thing of value Lynn owned. It was a summer garment for a winter reality, a memory of a home she no longer had, and it did nothing to stop the cold that had settled deep in her bones. 17 years old, an orphan in a land that had no use for her, she stood on the muddy boardwalk of Prospect's Gulch with the taste of failure bitter in her mouth. The owner of the town laundry, a woman with a face like a dried apple, had just shooed her away with a broom, muttering about not having work for her kind. Her parents had followed the promise of the railroad west, laying track until a fever took them both in the space of a week, leaving Lynn with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of Chinese characters she knew how to write. Now, that railroad was the engine of the town, but it offered her no passage, no comfort. The first flakes of snow, fat and wet, began to drift from a bruised-looking sky. They landed on her black hair and melted, cold trickles against her skin. She had 2 copper cents in her pocket, not enough for a piece of bread, let alone a room for the night. The social pressure of Prospect's Gulch was a physical thing, a collection of hard stares from miners and dismissive glances from the town's few respectable women. She was a ghost at their feast, a problem they wished would simply disappear. Inside the saloon, 2 trappers were talking loud enough for the whole street to hear. Their words cut through the rising wind. "Croft's still looking for help," one said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near the doorway. "Scared off the last one. Said the man's as wild as the mountains he lives on." "Ain't nobody gonna last a winter up there," the other snorted. "Not with him. 10 miles of bad trail, and a man who talks more to his horse than to people. He needs a cook, though what he'll get is another empty cabin come spring." The name was Jedediah Croft, a mountain man, a recluse. The words were meant as a warning, but to Lynn they sounded like a destination. 10 miles was a long walk, but staying in Prospect's Gulch was a slow death. She pulled the thin silk tighter around her shoulders, a useless gesture of defiance against the cold. A decision, hard and sharp, formed in her mind. She would walk. She would face the mountain man. After all, a wild mountain might be less cruel than a civilized town. The 10-mile walk was a battle against the thickening snow and the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. The trail climbed steadily, leaving the noise of the town behind and entering a world of silent, snow-laden pines. Twice she stumbled, her thin shoes soaked through and her feet numb. But the thought of the laundry owner's broom and the trappers' sneering faces pushed her onward. It was late afternoon when she finally saw it, a sprawling ranch nestled in a high meadow, smoke curling from the chimney of a large log cabin. It was a fortress of solitude, surrounded by sturdy corrals and a massive barn that dwarfed the main house. A man was in the main corral, working with a huge black stallion. He was bigger than any man Lynn had ever seen, a giant of a man with a chest as broad as a barrel, and shoulders that strained the seams of his leather coat. His hair and beard were long and untamed, the color of dark earth, and they were dusted with snow. He moved with a deliberate, powerful grace, his hands calming the restless animal with a sureness that was both gentle and absolute. This had to be Jedediah Croft. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, a small, brightly colored figure against the vast white landscape. The stallion sensed her first, letting out a low snort and tossing its head. The man turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. He said nothing, simply watched her approach, his expression unreadable, carved from the same stone as the mountains around them. Lynn stopped a respectful distance from the fence, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Her voice, when it came, was small but clear. "I heard you were looking for a cook. for a housekeeper?" Jedediah Croft finished stroking the horse's neck before he turned his full attention to her. His eyes were a pale, piercing gray, the color of a winter sky. He looked her up and down, taking in the impractical silk tunic, her slight frame, the exhaustion plain on her face. He saw a girl, not a worker, a stray, not a solution. "The town sent you?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. "No one sent me. I came myself." "This is no place for a child," he said, his tone flat. It wasn't unkind, just a statement of fact. "The work is hard. The winter is harder. You wouldn't last a week." He was about to turn back to his horse, the dismissal clear, when the first real blast of the blizzard hit. The wind howled down from the peaks, driving a wall of white before it. In seconds, the world beyond the corral disappeared. The trail she had just walked was gone, erased. The snow was no longer falling. It was a horizontal torrent. Jedediah looked from her to the swirling chaos and back again. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He couldn't send her back into that. Not even a wild man was that cruel. He let out a heavy sigh, a cloud of white in the frigid air. "The barn," he said, pointing with his chin toward the massive structure. "There's a clean stall with fresh hay. You can stay the night, but you leave when the storm breaks." It wasn't an offer of a job, but it was shelter. Therefore, Lynn simply nodded, a profound and silent wave of relief washing over her. She followed him as he led the stallion toward the barn, her small form nearly lost in his shadow. The blizzard raged for 2 days. Lynn spent them in the barn, a space that smelled of hay, animals, and cold leather. Jedediah brought her a plate of stew and a thick wool blanket the first night, setting them on a hay bale without a word before retreating to the main cabin. The next day he did the same. They did not speak. Lynn, in turn, did not sit idle. She found a broom and swept the main aisle until it was spotless. She refilled the water troughs, breaking the thin layer of ice that formed on top. She moved with a quiet efficiency that seemed to be her nature. On the third morning, the wind died down, leaving behind a world buried in silence and 3 feet of snow. A weak sun broke through the clouds, making the landscape glitter. Lynn knew she was expected to leave, but as she was gathering her resolve to face the man and the trail, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the barn. It was followed by a deep groan of tortured wood. She ran toward the sound. In the far section of the barn, a massive accumulation of snow on the roof had caused one of the main support beams to splinter. The roof above the stall holding the black stallion was visibly sagging, threatening to collapse at any moment. Jedediah was inside the stall, his massive shoulders pressed against the failing beam, trying to hold the weight of the entire roof by sheer force. His face was contorted with effort, the muscles in his neck standing out like ropes. The stallion, sensing the danger, was panicked, stamping its hooves and pulling at its tether. "Get out of there," he grunted, seeing her. "The whole thing's coming down." But Lynn didn't run. Her mind, quick and practical, assessed the situation not in terms of brute strength, but of angles and leverage. She saw a long, spare timber leaning against the far wall and a coil of thick rope hanging from a peg. While Jedediah fought a losing battle against gravity, she dragged the heavy beam into position outside the stall. With surprising speed, she looped the rope around the failing section of the roof truss, ran it down and around her spare timber, and used a sturdy post as a fulcrum. She pulled with all her might, creating a makeshift cantilever that transferred a portion of the roof's weight away from the broken beam and onto the solid outer wall. The groaning lessened. The downward sag of the roof halted. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it bought them time. Jedediah, feeling the pressure ease, stared at her from inside the stall. He looked from the rope to the beam she had positioned, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He had seen a small, fragile girl in a pink silk tunic. He had not seen an engineer. He slowly backed out of the stall, his chest heaving. He led the frightened horse to safety, then stood beside her, looking up at her handiwork. "How did you know to do that?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "My father worked on the railroad trestles," she said simply. "He explained how the weight must be shared. It is just balance." Jedediah was silent for a long time, his gray eyes studying her with a new kind of intensity. He was seeing her for the first time. He saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, the resilience that had carried her 10 miles through a coming storm, the competence that had just saved his best horse and a section of his barn. "The storm broke," he said finally, "but the trail won't be clear for a week. The kitchen is in the main cabin. You can start there." He did not say she had the job permanently, but he did not say she had to leave. And for Lynn, that was more than enough. The real test, she knew, had just begun, but she was about to find out that a collapsing roof was the least of her troubles. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Lynn brought order to the chaotic cabin, her presence a silent force of change. She learned the geography of the kitchen, the heft of the cast iron skillets, the way the wood stove drew best when the wind came from the west. Jedediah remained a man of few words, but he watched everything she did. He watched her mend his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He watched her keep a careful inventory of their dwindling supplies, her neat columns of figures a language he did not understand but respected. One morning, he found her staring at a stack of ledgers on his desk, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" he asked. "These numbers are wrong," she said, pointing to a page. "The freight company in Prospects Gulch has been overcharging you for 3 years." He looked at the page, at the swirling numbers and letters that were meaningless to him. He had always known he was being cheated, had felt it in the way the agents and clerks in town smirked at him, but he had never been able to prove it. He had relied on his size and his reputation to keep the worst of the wolves at bay, but the pen was a weapon he could not counter. "Fix it," he said, his voice thick with a strange mixture of anger and relief. And so, Lynn became more than a cook and a housekeeper. She became his eyes, his shield against a world that preyed on men like him. She wrote a letter to the freighter, a model of polite, unyielding clarity, outlining the discrepancy and demanding reimbursement. A week later, a chastened freight agent rode all the way up to the ranch with a credit voucher and a string of mumbled apologies. Their fragile partnership was solidified not with words, but with actions. It was in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh, warm milk from the morning's milking on the cabin porch for her, and the way she made sure a hot meal was waiting for him no matter how late he came in from the cold. In early December, their supplies ran low enough that a trip to town was unavoidable. Jedediah loaded the wagon, and Lynn, bundled in a heavy wool coat he had given her, sat beside him on the buckboard. The journey to Prospects Gulch was cold, but the silence between them was comfortable now. The town, however, was not. As they pulled up to the general store, their arrival caused an immediate stir. Eyes followed them from the saloon, from the smithy, from behind curtained windows. The mountain man and the Chinese girl. It was a spectacle. As Jedediah was loading sacks of flour into the wagon, a man stepped out of the land office across the street. He was impeccably dressed in a dark wool suit and a polished bowler hat, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn town. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, and he moved with an air of absolute confidence. This was Marcus Thorne. He strolled toward them, a polite smile fixed on his face. "Croft," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Good to see you down from your mountain. Winter treating you well?" Jedediah's shoulders tensed. He merely nodded, continuing his work. Thorne's eyes slid over to Lynn, a flicker of amusement and contempt in them. He looked her over as if she were a piece of livestock. "I see you've found some help," he said, drawing the word out. He spoke directly to Jedediah, pointedly ignoring Lynn as if she were a piece of furniture. "Must be difficult finding reliable workers. If she becomes a burden, you let me know. I can always find a place for a girl like her." The insinuation was ugly and unmistakable. It hung in the cold air, thick and foul. Several onlookers chuckled. Lynn felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up her neck. She stared straight ahead, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Jedediah stopped loading the flour. He turned slowly, his sheer size seeming to suck the air from around him. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply placed a hand flat on the side of the wagon, and his knuckles went white. The wood creaked under the pressure. "She's not my help," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She's my bookkeeper." The words dropped into the charged silence. Bookkeeper. It was a title of skill, of trust, of importance. It conferred a status that Thorne's insult could not easily touch. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The smirks on the faces of the onlookers vanished, replaced by confusion and a new, grudging respect. "Is that so?" Thorne recovered quickly. "Clever. Very clever." He tipped his hat, the smile back in place, but his eyes were cold. "Well, my offer stands. You have a good day, Croft." He walked away, leaving a trail of tension behind him. As they rode out of town, the silence in the wagon was heavy. Jedediah's jaw was set like granite. "He's been after my land for 2 years, he said, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Says the railroad needs a pass through the valley. He thinks because I can't read his papers, I'm a fool." He paused. "Thorne doesn't give up. That was just his first move." Lynn looked at the vast, snow-covered mountains surrounding them, at the man sitting beside her, a fortress of a man who was vulnerable in a way no one could see. She had come to this place seeking only wages, a roof over her head. But now she was standing between this man, this land, and the well-dressed wolf from town. The trouble was no longer just the cold, or the isolation, or the hard work. The trouble had a name, and it was Marcus Thorne. That night, the storm returned with a vengeance, isolating the ranch completely. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a mournful, lonely sound. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth cast a warm, flickering glow. Lynn was sitting at the small wooden table, mending a tear in Jedediah's heavy coat. Her stitches were small and precise, a line of order against the garment's frayed edges. Jedediah sat in his large chair by the fire, sharpening an axe head with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was the only sound besides the wind. He watched her hands, the way they moved with such deliberate grace. He had been watching her for weeks, seeing a strength that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with spirit. "My father couldn't read either," she said softly, not looking up from her work. The words hung in the quiet space between them. Jedediah stopped his work. He looked at her, waiting. "He was a good man, a smart man," she continued. "He could build anything, but men with papers always cheated him. They would smile and talk and make him put his mark on a page, and we would have less." Jedediah put the axe and stone down. He leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on his knees. "I never learned," he said, the admission costing him something. "My father was a trapper. He knew the woods, the animals. He said letters were for city folk and liars. He was half right." He got up and walked over to a large, locked chest in the corner of the room. He unlocked it with a key he wore on a leather cord around his neck. He reached inside and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He He brought it back to the fire and sat down, holding it in his big, calloused hands. "Thorne thinks this land is just dirt and trees," he said, his voice low. "It's not." He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. It was a single bead of pale green jade, intricately carved in the shape of a coiled dragon. It was clearly of Chinese origin, a stark contrast to the rough man who held it. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "She came here with a fur trading party from the coast. She was a healer. My father, he broke his leg miles from anywhere. She saved his life. She never left these mountains." Lynn looked from the bead to his face, at the high cheekbones and the slight almond shape to his eyes that she had never truly noticed before. It all made a sudden, shocking sense. His solitude, his otherness. "She died in a winter like this one," he went on, his gaze lost in the fire. "Pneumonia. I was 10. It was easier after that to just be the wild mountain man. People understand that. They don't understand a man who is two things at once." He was half Chinese. The secret explained everything. The gruffness that was a shield, the immediate, if reluctant, shelter he had offered her, the fierce protectiveness in front of Thorne. He was not just her employer. He was, in a way she could not have imagined, her kin. She looked at him, at this giant, lonely man, and felt a profound, aching connection that went far beyond gratitude. Their moment of quiet understanding was shattered a week later by the sound of approaching horses. It was Thorne, and he wasn't alone. He had a territorial deputy with him, a thin, weaselly man with a 10-star pinned to his coat. Jedediah met them on the porch, Lynn standing just inside the doorway. "Croft," Thorne said, his smile triumphant. He held up a document. "This is a notice of foreclosure. You defaulted on the supply loan you took out last spring from the mercantile. Your deed was the collateral." "I paid that loan," Jedediah growled. "The interest, Croft. It's always the interest," Thorne said smoothly. He handed the paper to the deputy. "It's all legal. The land is mine. You have 48 hours to vacate." The deputy, looking intimidated by Jedediah, but bolstered by Thorne, held out the paper. "It's the law, Croft." "Says right here." Jedediah stared at the document, at the meaningless squiggles that held the power to take his entire world away from him. He was trapped. Rage and helplessness warred on his face. "Let me see it," Lynn said, stepping out onto the porch. Thorne laughed. "What's this? The bookkeeper wants to read the fine print?" But Lynn's eyes were fixed on the paper. She took it from the deputy's hand. The legal language was dense, designed to confuse. She read it slowly, her finger tracing each line. The cold was biting, but she didn't feel it. All her focus was on the words. And then she found it. "This contract is fraudulent," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Now see here," the deputy began. "The interest rate," Lynn cut in, her voice sharp, "is listed at 30% per annum. Territorial law caps loans of this nature at 18%. The contract is illegal." She wasn't finished. She pointed to the bottom of the page. "And this signature date is March 3rd. But the letterhead on the paper is from the Mercantile's new stationery, which I know for a fact they did not receive from the printer in Cheyenne until April. The date was forged." She looked directly at Thorne, her small frame radiating an unshakable certainty. "You are a thief." Thorne's face went pale, then mottled with fury. "She's a liar, an ignorant foreign girl. What would she know?" But the deputy was looking at the paper, then at Thorne, a seed of doubt planted in his mind. Lynn had not been emotional. She had been specific. She had quoted law and pointed out physical evidence. It had the ring of truth. Lynn had made her choice. she had stepped out of the shadows and publicly accused a powerful, vindictive man. She was no longer invisible, no longer just a cook or a housekeeper. She was Jedediah Croft's bookkeeper, his defender. And in the cold mountain air, she knew her life, and his, would never be the same. By the following spring, when the mountain passes cleared and the high meadow was covered in a carpet of new green, the name Marcus Thorne was only a bitter memory in Prospect's Gulch. The deputy, his suspicions roused by Lynn's clear-eyed accusations, had quietly sent a telegraph to the U.S. Marshal in Helena. The investigation that followed uncovered a pattern of predatory loans and forged documents going back years. Thorne fled the territory one night ahead of an arrest warrant, leaving his polished suits and his schemes behind him. The High Meadow Ranch was secure. More than that, it was thriving. With Lynn managing the accounts, Jedediah was no longer at the mercy of cheats and swindlers. They sold a herd of 30 cattle to the Army garrison at Fort Shaw, and for the first time, the payment, $450 in solid silver coin, was exactly what it was supposed to be. The money, counted and stacked by Lynn on the kitchen table, was proof of their partnership. The cabin was no longer just Jedediah's shelter. It was their home. Lynn had planted a small garden near the porch, and the first tender shoots of carrots and peas were pushing through the dark, rich earth. Their trips to town were different now. The whispers had been replaced by nods of respect. The store owner, who had once ignored Lynn, now saved the best cuts of bacon for her, asking her opinion on the price of grain. They were no longer the strange mountain man and his foreign girl. They were the Crofts of High Meadow Ranch, a name that had come to mean honesty and resilience. People in town never spoke of them as married, but they spoke of them as one unbreakable unit. One warm evening in June, Jedediah called Lynn out to the porch. He had built a small, sturdy chest from cedar wood, its surface sanded smooth as glass. He presented it to her without a word. She opened the lid. Inside, laid carefully on a piece of dark blue velvet he must have bought in town, was her light pink silk tunic. The fabric was clean, and the small tears from her journey up the mountain had been painstakingly mended, the stitches clumsy but earnest. It was his work. "That's not for work clothes," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's for other times." Lynn looked at the tunic, the last remnant of her old life, now preserved as a treasure in her new one. She looked up at the huge, quiet man beside her, at the kindness in his winter sky eyes. She understood. The tunic was no longer a symbol of a home she had lost. It was a beautiful thing to be kept safe in the home she had found. She reached out and placed her small hand on his arm, and he covered it with his own. In a hard country, strength wasn't always measured in the size of a man's hands or the sharpness of his axe. Sometimes it was measured in the quiet courage of a girl who could read the words meant to break you. And it was found in the wisdom of a man who was strong enough to admit he needed her to see them. Jedediah had once told her she'd find more than wages on his mountain. He was right. You could find a home, a partnership, a future. But you had to be brave enough to claim it, and wise enough to recognize it when it stood right in front of you.